ввиду расширения блока НАТО на восток.
NATO's expansion.
И обещание нашей стране не расширять ни на 1 дюйм НАТО на восток.
When you look at the actual agreements, there were no final commitments by NATO not to enlarge.
Russia has demanded that NATO should stop expanding eastwards.
Presidents of Albania and Croatia to join
NATO threatening Russian security.
Montenegro joins NATO.
Vladimir Putin responds to NATO's expansion.
Finland and Sweden.
The leaders of the country have formally announced their intention to join
NATO.
Russia's land border with NATO doubling in length.
To start, it's important to understand that NATO is a defensive alliance, with the primary purpose of protecting its member states from potential threats. However, some Russian leaders may view the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe as a threat to Russia's security and influence in the region. To be sure, NATO and NATO expansion have always been sources of tension in US-Soviet and US-Russian relations. Since its founding in 1949, NATO has kept its door open to new members who meet the criteria for admission. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, no one should be surprised that countries formerly annexed, subjugated, and invaded by the Soviet Union might seek closer security ties to the West. Many of those who blame the current Ukraine conflict on NATO overlook the fact that in the 30 years that have elapsed since the end of the Cold War, Moscow's rejection of NATO expansion has veered in different directions at different times. When President Boris Yeltsin agreed to sign the Russia-NATO Founding Act in 1997, Russia and the alliance codified into this agreement a comprehensive agenda of cooperation. After September 11, 2001, Presidents Bush and Putin forged a close, cooperative relationship to fight a common enemy, terrorism. At the time, Putin was focused on cooperation with NATO, not confrontation. The only time the alliance has ever invoked Article 5 on collective defense was to support a NATO intervention in Afghanistan, an action that Putin supported at the UN Security Council. He then followed up this diplomatic support with concrete military assistance for the alliance. When NATO announced in 2002 its plan for a major wave of expansion that would include 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Putin barely reacted. He certainly did not threaten to invade any of the countries to keep them out of NATO. Putin even maintained the same attitude when it was a question of Ukraine someday entering the Atlantic Alliance. In May 2002, when asked for his views on the future of Ukraine's relations with NATO, Putin dispassionately replied, "I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the processes of expanding interaction with NATO and the Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the Ukraine-NATO Council. At the end of the day, the decision is to be taken by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter for those two partners."
3 reasons behind what Russia's doing. One is the geopolitical concern. The Russians want a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine is a very important part of that. So they're trying to bring it back. But there are 2 other issues at play here. One, I think, is a domestic political concern, and that is for the Kremlin, a Western-oriented, democratic, economically successful. That kind of Ukraine is a nightmare for the Kremlin because it leads to Russians asking, why can't we have the same political voice and the same democratic rights that they have in Ukraine? And then there's a third reason, which I just think it's Vladimir Putin, and he's quite emotional about Ukraine. He's very emotional and even angry about it.
Putin may dislike NATO expansion, but he is not genuinely frightened by it. Russia has the largest army in Europe, now much more capable after 2 decades of lavish spending. NATO is a defensive alliance. It has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia, and it never will. Putin knows that. But Putin is threatened by a successful democracy in Ukraine. He cannot tolerate a successful, flourishing, and democratic Ukraine on his borders, especially if the Ukrainian people also begin to prosper economically. That undermines the Kremlin's own regime stability and proposed rationale for autocratic state leadership. Just as Putin cannot allow the will of the Russian people to guide Russia's future, he cannot allow the people of Ukraine, who have a shared culture and history, to choose the prosperous, independent, and free future that they have voted for and fought for. Additionally, the deployment of NATO forces and military equipment close to Russia's border may be seen as provocative by the Russian government. This is particularly the case in the aftermath of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, which led to increased tensions between Russia and NATO.
Принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine. Speaking on national television, Mr. Putin urged Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms and go home.
We can see the Ukrainian forces exerting a very comprehensive push across the whole territory.
Ukraine's army has said it made major gains around the port city of Kherson following Russia's announcement that its troops were withdrawing from the area.
Jubilation in the streets as Ukrainian soldiers retook the strategic city of Kherson after Russian forces retreated.
The Ukraine-Russia crisis began in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, a region that had previously been a part of Ukraine. This action was met with condemnation from the international community, and tensions between Russia and Ukraine have been high ever since. In the years that followed, fighting broke out in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian government forces and pro-Russian separatists, leading to thousands of deaths and the displacement of millions of people. The conflict is ongoing, and efforts to peacefully resolve it have had limited success.
And targeted sanctions, we will target strategic sectors of the Russian economy by blocking their access to technologies and markets that are key for Russia.
Sixth package of sanctions against Moscow over its war on Ukraine and called for a phased embargo of Russian oil imports by the end of the year.
The Biden administration's plans for sanctioning Russia are taking shape. U.S. institutions would be prohibited from dealing with major Russian banks and state companies.
This was a direct and debilitating hit on the Russian economy. The removal of Russian banks from the SWIFT financial network and the sanctioning of the Russian central bank are unprecedented in their impact, and they're sending Russia back to the 20th century in terms of its financial standing.
Yeah, quite right. The ruble has sunk to another record low.
His announcement last week sparked an exodus of Russians fleeing across the border into Georgia, Finland, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and elsewhere to avoid being conscripted.
More than 30 countries have imposed sanctions against Russia, cutting energy imports, blocking financial transactions and halting shipments of key imports, such as semiconductors and other electronics. They also include travel bans and asset freezes against Russian individuals and entities. The EU has periodically reviewed and extended these sanctions, and they remain in place as of today. It's worth noting that both sides have their own perspective on these issues and their own interests at play. While some in Russia may view NATO as a potential threat, others in NATO may see Russia's actions in the region as destabilizing. Ultimately, the relationship between Russia and NATO is complex and multifaceted, with a long history of cooperation and tension. Understanding these complexities is crucial to understanding the current state of relations between the two sides. Thank you for watching.